When I was writing this book, an email appeared in my inbox with an attachment. Now, I usually don't open attachments, viruses, dangerous, all that kind of stuff. But this one seemed safe enough, and I knew where it was coming from. It was a long discussion of godly government that had been produced by the Doctrinal Committee of the United Church of God. We know those folks. They're nice people. We're friends of theirs. They were attempting to develop a biblically based explanation of how they as a church were governed. And that, in our tradition, has long been a thorn of contention, is church government. Just what's it like? And I remember facing it in 1958 when I was coming as a member of the church and when I was baptized in that year. Anyway, they were trying to get it all together. And as I read along, I came across a paragraph that brought several of the questions I've been wrestling with into sharp relief. Here's what the paper said about government in marriage. When God created Eve, a new level of government came into existence. Prior to her creation, God led Adam to realize he was incomplete and needed a partner. That Eve was to be his helper indicates Adam was to be the leader. Confirmed in part by Paul, 1 Corinthians 11:3. The head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is the man, the head of Christ is God. Not because of any inferiority on her part. She was comparable to him, but rather as a difference in family function. Government authority within the family structure was thus established by God with the creation of the first family prior to sin entering into the world. Now, the last thing I would want to do would be to pick an argument with the Doctrinal Committee of the United Church of God. But if I may offer constructive criticism, the first sentence in this the opening sentence seemed wrong to me. As I read through the paper, I found a lot of emphasis on authority, both in the church and in marriage. What I didn't find, maybe I overlooked it, was an adequate explanation of the relationship within which the authority is exercised, which is what? Covenant. Covenant. That it is the covenant that describes the relationship. Now, everybody and his dog knows that marriage in the Bible is a covenant. There's nothing new about that. But the fact of the matter is, authority is exercised in marriage within the terms of the marriage covenant. Now, there is leadership in marriage, to be sure, but that leadership is defined by the covenant. It seemed obvious to me that what came into existence with Eve was not a new level of authority, but a new covenant. And there's that magic phrase, new covenant. Actually, it's pretty old. It seemed obvious to me, but looking back, it's clear enough that marriage is the oldest covenant known to man. But never mind, it was new on that day. And if that's true, then I think it's worth our time to think a while about this relationship and what it was like from the start. The story began with a statement from God. I love it. It is not good for a man to be alone. And I thought long and hard about that, and I considered, man is made in the image of God. If it's not good for man to be alone, then perhaps God felt it was not good for him to be alone either. And so consequently, man, if he's going to be like God, could not be left alone. With that prologue, God decided to make Adam a help that was comparable to him. He then anesthetized Adam, took a rib from him, and used it to make a woman, and he brought her to Adam. Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed." Now, the doctrinal question in paper argued that since Eve was made a helper to Adam, the man was supposed to be the leader. That sounds reasonable except for this. Psalm 33, verse 18. "Behold, the eye of the Lord is upon them that fear him, upon them that hope in his mercy, to deliver their soul from death and to keep them alive in famine. Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help. He is our shield." The word for help here is precisely the same as it is in Genesis. Eve was found a help comparable to Adam, God is our help, and we are hardly in charge of God. So consequently, what I take from this is Eve was to help Adam as Adam was to help Eve. This was a comparable thing. Now, looking again to the Hebrew, the word for comparable is neged, a part opposite or counterpart. Thus, the woman was made not as an inferior, but as a part opposite to man. Some women, I think, take that opposite business a little too far, but never mind, that's a sermon for another day. The woman was to be a counterpart for man, a duplicate, something that fit him perfectly. When Adam looked at the woman, he said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." Nothing could have been closer. My bones, my flesh. She was actually taken from his body, as every man from then on who would ever live was taken from the body of a woman, his mother. They were made of the same substance, bone and flesh. They shall be called one flesh, even though they are two persons. And upon the basis of Adam's statement, listen to this now, that she shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore, and the therefore is operative here, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. The old relation is superseded. Not canceled. I mean, you're no longer your father's son. You still have a relationship with your parents. But the point is the old relationship is superseded. A new family is created. And the two of them now, in law, to be one flesh. You know, we use the word corporation a great deal in our society and all. And sometimes I think we forget that the corporation simply means this is a body. It is a body in law, been created. It doesn't make any difference how many people are in it. In law, it is treated as a person. Now, it's of more than passing interest in this point that man, male and female, was made in God's image. And that man was male and female. This is strongly suggesting of the long-standing dogma that God, Father, and Son are one substance. That goes back to the origins of Christianity. As Adam and Eve are one flesh, so Father and Son are one spirit. Everyone easily understands how Adam and Eve can be considered one flesh, be one. So where's the mystery in saying that God, Father, and Son are one? The story of the first family concludes with the observation that the man and his wife were naked and they were not ashamed. Now, it wasn't immediately clear to me why they would be ashamed. For one thing, it was just the two of them. Nobody else was around. In the second place, there weren't any clothes. You know, I don't know that did they have a frame of reference? Have even known what it meant to be naked? No, we're just here. It says they were not ashamed. Why should they be? So I looked up the word again. The Hebrew bush means literally, to pale, which is kind of the opposite of blushing, one would think. But a secondary meaning, and the idea of going pale, is when you are disappointed or set back on something. I dare say Adam and Eve were not disappointed in what they saw of each other on this occasion. Two perfect physical creatures, and there they were. This joining of man and woman as one flesh is the oldest and highest expression of human covenant. It's the oldest because, well, after all, it was the first covenant of any kind ever existed on this planet. It's the highest because it is in the very image of God. Family. Out of this covenant will come children who will leave that family and form new families, each of them involving a new covenant. There'll be a new covenant exercised tonight as two lovers become man and wife one more time. Now, I had long understood the word covenant is roughly synonymous with contract, but I hadn't really thought about the connection with the Jewish idea of a marriage contract. In Judaism, you may not know this, marriage is not a sacrament. It is a civil contract. I don't even know if Jews call God as witness to their marriages or not. I have not studied it that far. The marriage contracts among Jews customarily specified what the father of the groom would pay for the bride, what the groom is providing to the marriage, what he will have to give the bride upon a divorce, what is to happen to the children in such an event, what property rights are involved, and anything else deemed germane to what's going on here. Now, very often, the parents of the bride and groom in Jewish, I doubt if it's as true today as it used to be, but certainly it was for a long time. The parents of the bride and groom were signatories to the contract in addition to the bride and groom. But I suppose that's because they had to acknowledge certain inheritance considerations, also to acknowledge that they were letting go. Some Jewish sages insisted upon a marriage contract and said that to maintain a wife without a contract or without specification or fair conditions should be regarded as prostitution. That's a painful way of putting it. Well, others seem to say, and it seems a little bit lighter, keeping a woman without a contract makes her a concubine. Perhaps in our generation, the same thing as a common law wife. Now, the essence of the contract is the enumeration of the conditions that the husband guarantees to fulfill regarding his wife, financial, other guarantees. It includes even payment in the event of a divorce and inheritance provisions where the children are concerned. They get this thing all spelled out before they ever walk down the aisle or stand under the canopy or whatever the particular ceremony would be. Now, if you enter a marriage without a contract in Texas, all these situations are governed by the laws of the state. The state decides what happens. The state decides inheritance. The state has all that worked out in state law. And so when you sign the marriage contract, in a sense, you have actually created a marriage contract by signing the license, whether you realized it or wanted it or not. So it is a marriage contract. Now, you weren't thinking about any of these things as you planned your wedding. Especially if you were never married before. A couple of kids, getting married like we were at age 19. Never crossed our mind, because as far as we were concerned, what she had was mine, what I had was hers, and there wasn't much of either one of them. And so it was easy at that particular stage of things. All we cared was we loved one another, wanted to spend the rest of our lives together, and we've got 54 years of it on the way so far. And, it's just something that we never thought about. So the state thinks about these things. The state says, okay, this young couple their heads are all full of air and wonderful thoughts, and they're not thinking. So what we're going to do, we're going to say this. We create community property laws to determine that the wealth that is generated within this marriage belongs equally to both parties. We're going to create laws of inheritance that control, in the event of the death of one or the other of them, how the property is handed down. We're going to create laws that will determine what is to happen with the children, how they go to court, what the judge decides, how the state will enforce it, and so forth. The state works all that out because you don't have the heart when you're a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed 19-year-old kid walking down the aisle or getting ready to see her coming down the aisle. You don't have the brains to figure out all these things. And you don't have the money to pay a lawyer to figure them out for you, so you just get married and trust the state to take care of it. That may or may not be a good idea. I'll leave it to you to think that over. But this is the way it is. Now, what business is it, though, of the state to even worry their head about this at all? Oh, to me, that's a no-brainer. The state has an absolute obligation to see to the care of children, because the children are the future of the state. You can't afford to let children be abused. You can't afford to let them be neglected. You can't afford to have them thrown out on the street or tossed in a dumpster. And so the state has every reason to vigorously look after the rights of children, to protect them from harm, and to see to it, in the case their parents lose their minds and decide to break up after, 10 years of marriage or whatever it is, throwing things at each other, that the kids will be taken care of. That somebody with 3 brain cells lined up can make a decision what's going to happen with these children. So signing your marriage contract and ratifying it in the presence of witnesses, you actually enter a contract with provisions described by state law that affect inheritance, divorce, and many other considerations. Now, I presume getting married in Texas, you're subject to Texas law on this, but our couple tonight will be moving off to Connecticut, and I have a feeling that Connecticut will have laws that once they've established residence up there as a married couple, Connecticut law will control. But in any case, the law does control. Much of state law covers the same stuff that's found in many Jewish marriage contracts. The latter were being formed long before there was a civil society. But man, over the generations, has learned there are some things you got to do, some things that have to be taken care of, and you can't plan on young people getting married in their first flush of love to think about this. Now, I've often thought that it is a shame that so much of the marriage contract for most of us is strictly oral. You know, we say it. We say it in front of witnesses. But frankly, I don't think very many married couples will really remember what they said, except I do or I will. You know, they're thinking about one another. He's thinking about dropping a ring on the floor. She's thinking about her veil and whether she can get it away in time or not. That kiss is out there lingering, waiting and waiting. And so consequently, their minds are not that sharp on those vows. That's why I think it would be an awfully good thing if they had a marriage contract and you signed up on those vows before you ever got down there to the altar and you really knew where you were going with it. What if your wife, for example, were able to whip out a contract and say, see, before we got married, you agreed that you would always put your dirty socks in the hamper. Now, you'd really be up against it if you really had signed a marriage contract and said, I will do that. I mean, what could you say? What could you do? You just pretty well have to go along, wouldn't you? And the same thing's true the other way around. You could get an agreement with your wife before you get married that she could only remind you of something 3 times in one day. But you got to get that before marriage. You wait till after marriage, you'll never get it. Now, to those who are living together without a signed marriage contract, I don't know if anybody here falls in that category or not, so I'm not picking on you. If you're living together without a signed marriage contract prepared either by the lawyer or by the state, there are a few things we can say. From a biblical point of view, at best, a concubine, at worst, a prostitute. Really. And the problem with this, unless your state law makes you a common law wife, in other words, a concubine, and thus grants you certain rights, you have none. And you have little or no protection under the law, neither would any children, intentional or otherwise. And I see young couples making this mistake all the time. And they don't consider what they are doing and the implications of what they're doing. And how many young women nowadays are willing, foolishly, and I'm sorry, that's the way it is, to enter what amounts to concubinage with a man who, just because he's not willing to marry her yet, says he will someday. Maybe someday we will, but I just want to be sure we're going to be able to get along after we get married. There is no guarantee you're going to get along after you're married. In fact, you are not going to get along after you're married. It's in the overcoming of the not getting along that love grows, that character grows, that families become stronger. I mean, if you think you're not going to have your problems after you get married, you really probably should wait a while. Our 2 tonight are already old enough to know better, so we're going to give them... We'll give them some slack on this particular occasion. Marriage is a contractual arrangement. There's a government within the relationship, but the relationship comes first. And then that determines how the authority is developed. I'm not going to go there today, but there's a really fine developed theme in Ephesians chapter 5 by the Apostle Paul. I think I have it somewhere in the book, where he opens up this question where he says, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fit in the Lord. Now, I don't know how many sermons I've heard in my life. I have heard at least as many that went that far and then closed the Bible and took off. At least as many that did that as went on through the remainder of it. Because what you have in 1 Corinthians 5, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands in the Lord, is followed by the statement to the men, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. You that big, guys? Are you big enough for that? Are you ready to step up to that requirement? Because you see, when Paul talks about it, let's submit ourselves to one another, as he says in one place. This is mutual submission. He's talking about the church at the time. But he says, submit yourselves to one another. How do you do that? Don't you have to, isn't submission a one-way street? You got the higher up here and the lower submits to the higher? The only way you can have mutual submission is by covenant. And in covenant, you submit, both of you, to the covenant. And thereby, you can have mutual submission. And that's what Paul's talking about in Ephesians, the 5th chapter. It's mutual submission of a husband and wife because both of them submit to the covenant, the marriage covenant, and the two separate, strong responsibilities. And I think I would lay the heavier responsibility in that on the husband in Ephesians 5. It seems to me to be far more demanding of him than it is of her. Because he has to go, a long way down the road to love his wife like Christ loved the church. Which, as far as I can see, means he lays his life on the line for her at whatever danger may be coming along the road. Now, falling in love is wonderful. It's essential in marriage, but it doesn't make a marriage without a covenant. It's been argued in some quarters that the Bible doesn't specify any marriage ceremony, so marriage ceremony isn't important. You ever heard that argument? Some girls have heard it from some guys. It's true that there is no marriage ceremony in the Bible, but it's entirely irrelevant. There is marriage covenant in the Bible. And you can't escape that by any clever manipulation of words and scriptures. Marriage covenant is in the Bible. And a woman should never, ever, ever allow a man into her bed without a covenant. She's risking her children, she's risking herself, she's risking her emotional well-being, and whoever knows what else may come. The wedding ceremony is just part of the covenant. It's the covenant that rules, not the ceremony. Now, what does all that have to do with godly government? Well, quite a lot, actually, because the government of God always seems to be based on covenant. Make your way through the Bible, and you'll find it at every turn. And the government is always determined by the covenant. Now, marriage, as I said, is the oldest covenant known to man. And there is a strong analogy between marriage and the covenant God made with Israel. An analogy the prophets borrow on very heavily when God divorces Israel and all these things. Now, some people have made the mistake of thinking that, this means that the old covenant, the covenant of God with Israel, was a marriage covenant. No, it was not. Only by analogy is it a marriage covenant. Marriage is a covenant. This was a covenant. So the prophets can grab hold of these and say, and they can use the marriage as an illustration of what it means to God when Israel goes out and plays the whore. We understand how that particular works. Now, but remember when you read the prophets, it is always and it is only an analogy. It's really with God as a covenant. Now, Malachi developed this theme in his rebuke to the priests. And I'm almost hesitant to bring it up today in the sermon, but I think I probably should do it anyway because it's God's word that's relevant. And the rebuke that he's laying on here is a rebuke to the priests in particular. But it's one I think all of us should probably and would do well to take heed of. The reason I'm a little hesitant is because I know how many of our people have come from the world. They've had sometimes more than one marriage. They've had more than one failed marriage. They've struggled through life, and life is hard. Life is just hard. And consequently, they have gone through this experience, come out the other side of it, and have struggled from there on in with how their life is going to be from here on out. Now, I've addressed this in this book again, in a chapter on the marriage covenant and on divorce law. So I won't go into this at all here, except to say that the Bible holds out a great deal of hope and promise through God's grace for people who have been divorced and subsequently remarried. And some ideas that people have had in the past that you've got to break up existing marriages to right some old wrong, all that does is add one more wrong in it. And two negatives don't add up to a positive by anybody's math. Well, Malachi says, and this is chapter 2, verse 10, talking to the priests, mind you, have we not all one Father? Did not one God create us? Why do we profane the covenant of our fathers by breaking faith with one another? To break faith with one another is to breach a covenant. And to God, covenants are sacred. Covenants made between a man and his wife. Covenants made between two men. Covenants made between God and man. God holds covenants as the gold standard. And so consequently, he says, why in the world do you profane the covenant of your fathers, breaking faith with one another? Judah has broken faith. A detestable thing is committed in Israel and Jerusalem. Judah has desecrated the sanctuary the Lord loves by marrying the daughter of a strange god. You know what he's talking about? He's talking about Israel entering into new relationships with other gods. I mean, there were gods all over the place in that world at that time. You had Baal in some of the areas, Moloch in other areas, Chemosh down in Moab, I believe. Ashtoreth was everywhere. I don't know how she managed that, but she did. And all these gods were scattered all over the Middle East. And so Solomon married his wives, and to keep his wives happy, he built temples for their gods. And we wind up finding later on that they have moved these pagan priests, worship, and everything else right on to the Temple Mount and the house of God. And this is Malachi's drawing the analogy that Israel has married the daughter of a strange god. Solomon really did. And for the man who does this, whoever he may be, may the Lord cut him off from the tents of Jacob, even though he brings offerings to the Lord Almighty. Another thing, just be a priest, you're still going to get cut off. Another thing you do, you flood the Lord's altar with tears. You weep and wail because he no longer pays attention to your offerings, nor will he accept them from your hands. You say, well, why? And he answered, it's because the Lord is acting as a witness between you and the wife of your youth, because you have broken faith with her, though she is your partner, the wife of your marriage covenant. What he's saying here to the priest is, you're crying about the fact that God won't hear and won't accept your offerings and won't hear your prayers anymore. Do you know why? It's because of the way you've treated your wives. Pure and simple. Now I'll add here, as I said, I know there are all too many here who are no longer with the wife of their youth for one reason or another. But divorce is not the unpardonable sin. And sometimes we have to trust in God's grace to allow us to go forward after mistakes we have made in the past. But he goes on to say, has not the Lord made them one in flesh and in spirit? They are his. And why one? Why one? Why did God do all this? Because he was seeking godly offspring. Isn't that something? We go all the way back to Malachi, to the law of God, and find that all this stuff in the Bible about marriage, divorce, fealty, covenants, and so forth was to get a godly offspring. It was for the children. And God bless the state of Texas, and I imagine the state of Connecticut, for at least thinking about the children somewhere along the line when young couples getting married don't. Because the state has now inherited that responsibility whenever parents give it up. I hate divorce, says the Lord God Almighty. I hate a man's covering himself with violence as well, but like he's wearing a garment. He hates divorce, hates the second divorce, third divorce, whatever it may be, just like he hated the first one. And you don't remedy an old error by creating a new one. But sometimes human beings can get out of control. And as I said, I have a chapter in Law and Divorce on divorce law, so I won't go there again, but it does explain how it's possible for a person who's been through that trauma to be married again. But having been forgiven and given a new start does not exempt you from the words of God. Therefore, take heed to your spirit that you deal not treacherously. You know, there was a time when being a man of your word or a woman of your word was really worth something. We seem to have slid away from that. I'm not altogether sure why. But when you give your word, whether it's in a contract where you write it down or whether you give it in person and shake hands with the other guy or look him in the eye and say, I will. The scripture says that a man is going to dwell in God's tabernacle as a man who swears to his own hurt and doesn't change. So as a way of life, being true to your word, being true to your promise, being true to your covenants is crucial with God. Breaking covenant, whether with God, your wife, your husband, is treachery, whether it be your first marriage, second marriage, or fifth. Researchers are fond of comparing the Israelite covenant to the marriage as a marriage of God, but we should remember this is only a metaphor, as I said. The reason is the analogy works so well because both relationships are covenants. We mustn't overlook one very important statement in this. And it'll be something we think about tonight. It says, the Lord is acting as the witness between you and the wife of your youth. With us, marriage is not merely a civil contract. I don't think I've ever been to a marriage in our church where people were not called on to make these promises in the presence of God and these witnesses. Therefore, we call God as a witness in our marriage, and God says, I will then act as a witness between you when the time comes. When we make vows in a wedding ceremony, these promises are made in the presence of God and all those assembled. Then we sign our marriage license, which for most is their marriage contract. Then the witnesses to the marriage also sign. Consider the implication. We call on God to witness our covenant. Are we then going to betray our mate and violate that covenant witnessed by God, who stood looking over your shoulder in the ceremony, and who watched as you signed your names, and in effect, signed his own? Now let's be sure we understand what God is saying. It's not merely that God hates divorce because it hurts society. The problem with divorce in God's mind is it involves the breaking of a covenant, which with God is an extremely severe sin. He expects his people to be people of their word, to make vows and keep them, to be the kind of person who, having sworn to his own hurt, stands by his word. Note the repeated use in here of breaking faith through this section. The term implies not merely making a mistake, but the violation of a sacred covenant. Treachery is not merely shooting yourself in the foot, breaking apart of a sacred contracted relationship. Now, some have wondered why, in the law of Moses, premarital sex is not dealt with in the same way that adultery is dealt with. A young couple who are unmarried and uncommitted get a little too friendly someday and have sex together. The Bible does not require that you stone them to death. But we do know what the Bible requires in regarding a woman who is married, don't we? Rather, the young man is required to marry the girl if the father permits, and the father may not even permit it. For all we know, there are some young men that I can sure see, and I would say no to my daughter marrying them no matter what had happened, provided he lived long enough to find out. Now, if a woman who is married to a man commits adultery, she may be stoned to death along with the man. What's the difference? The act is the same. The difference is that the married woman is in covenant. The single woman is not. The difference is that adultery is treachery, while premarital sex betrays no existing covenant. Now, premarital sex is sin. It's harmful. It's dangerous. Neither the woman nor any children from the union have any protection under the law. It's dangerous for a man, but it's really dangerous for the woman. Because if there is a baby that comes from that, she's stuck with that child. 18 years. It's an 18-year sentence she gets. It does not, though, involve any betrayal of covenant with one's mate for life. That's why it's dealt with differently in the Old Testament. And don't ever think from that it's not wrong. It is definitely wrong and a sin. It just doesn't carry the same weight that breaking covenant does. Now, there are other laws that deal with the same idea, and they are deeply rooted in a culture that's very different from our own. It has been a custom in many societies for the family of the bride to give a sum of money or other valuables to the groom, the family of the groom, as a dowry. Generally, it's a contribution to help the happy pair get off to a good start. Because of the inability of poor families to pay a dowry, a custom tended to prevent the marriage of a poor girl into a wealthy family. You can see how that would be, wouldn't you? I got no money. I can't, this rich guy over here, I can't give him anything. He's not going to marry my girl. Now, the opposite of this practice, which made its way from Rome to British common law, is called the dower, where the family of the groom pays money to the family of the bride. Now, you got girls, that's something you'd like to really see in effect, right? Presumably, this would improve the lot of the girl to be married off into a better family. It appears that the custom of dower was actually regulated by Israelite law. And I think many people don't quite understand what this means, but here it is. It's Exodus 21, verse 7. If a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, She shall not go out as the men servants do. If she please not her master who has betrothed her to himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. To sell her to a strange nation, he shall have no power, seeing he has dealt deceitfully with her. He's been treacherous in this deal. Now, I'm presuming that what's taking place here is taking place before a marriage is actually consummated, but he actually brought her into his family, either with marriage in mind, either for himself or his son. In this case, the girl was effectively contracted as an amma. It's fascinating to me how that word amma has made its way through all kinds of Eastern languages, and it basically means a nanny in those societies. The context of the law in the Bible suggests that although she enters the new family as an amma, the purpose is marriage, okay? Now, he has paid a dower for her. And even though the custom of the time might have been allowed to allow an indentured servant to be sold off to somebody else, he couldn't do that with this girl. Not at all. The object, in fact, with any female servant. The object of the law, then, turns out to be exactly the opposite of what you might think. That women are chattel, we can trade them back and forth. In that world, in that time, this law was designed to protect the rights of women. That's what it was about. And I think that's a really interesting thing to know. The law, though, goes further than that. It says, if he has betrothed her to his son, then he is going to treat her like a daughter. Right in the household, the same rank as his daughters. If he takes himself another wife, her food, her raiment, her duty of marriage, shall he not diminish. And if he doesn't do these three to her, she shall go out free without money. Now, that's a bigger thing than you might think, because a lot of money has been paid. And if she had to be redeemed, the family had to scrape that money up and buy her back. But if he doesn't do his job, she can walk away and nobody has to pay anything for what needs to be done. The contract then is null and void, money is forfeit. Now notice, I'm using the word contract here almost synonymously with covenant, and they are very closely related. Marriages have commonly been contracts or covenants in most societies. It's interesting to know how that works out, even though the societies know nothing of the Bible. In this case, the contract is broken because the man has dealt deceitfully with her, and the expression is bagad, the same one we saw in Malachi, which is treacherously. Now, this evening, we have the chance to observe a reenactment of the oldest covenant known to man. In this case, the happy pair are not in their youth. They've been a little further down the road, and you're welcome. Their road to this place, as the road of an awful lot of us, has been bumpy in places. But they have found each other, and for that we're all very happy. And this marriage is no less the same covenant God created with Adam and Eve in any way. And it's a covenant, it is the covenant that describes the relationship that would exist between the couple with all the emphasis of Ephesians 5. And we should remember, there will be one witness to the ceremony tonight who will not be signing the marriage license, but he will be there as a witness and in an important way, a guarantor of the covenant.